Okay, so again, like others have stated, I just want to thank the Michigan DNR and the for their invitation to this event. It's been a wonderful event from my perspective. It's been great to meet some of these folks that we've been hearing about for years and get some questions that have been plaguing me answered directly. Thank you. So I'm going to talk about our Illinois Deer Management Program. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge a couple things. Now, I'm more of a foot on the ground guy. I came up through our ranks as a district wildlife biologist, dealing with the day-to-day stuff. And unfortunately, they say you don't want to be, it's a matter of being in the right place at the right time. Well, I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. CWD showed up in my district at the time, and so I've been involved with it ever since. But I don't want to claim to be a real smart, the smart bulb in the pack. We've been blessed with support from researchers from the Illinois Natural History Survey and the University of Illinois School of Veterinary Medicine, Dr. Nora Mateus Pania, Dr. Jan Nowaskowski, and Dr. Michelle Green have been very active in our research efforts in Illinois relative to CWD. But for the most, but more than even them, I'd like to acknowledge the contributions of Dr. Paul Shelton. He's our Forest Wildlife Program Manager, and it's his intelligence, it's his vision, his dedication to this effort that have led us down a path that seemingly has been successful, at least to a degree. So thanks, Paul. Just as a reference, if you're looking for more information about our Illinois program, if you just get on our DNR website, there's some really good stuff. We've got a 4-part video series that describes our program and talks about the CWD disease and testing and that kind of thing. So those people who are interested in learning more about the basics of the disease, I'd encourage you to check that out. And then all of our annual reports and whatnot are available. So if you Google Illinois CWD, you'll get to our website. As far as our story, we first picked up our first positive in 2002, shortly, like 6 months after Wisconsin picked up their first, or had reported their first one. It was a suspect animal that was collected and was located near Roscoe, Illinois, which is a town, if those who are familiar with Illinois, Rockford, Illinois is about the central north edge of the state, and Roscoe is just above that, right along the Winnebago County line, just south of Wisconsin. Just briefly, our program, basically we boil down to two basic components. There's a surveillance aspect to the program, basically testing, trying to test animals, document where the tests are coming from to give us an idea of where the disease is and where it isn't, and then a management aspect. So basically in surveillance, we want to try and get enough samples throughout the state to give us a good idea of where CWD is. We want to be able to document the distribution of the disease and then as well as prevalence rates, and then try to track those changes over time. Most of our samples we collect come from hunter harvested animals, primarily through our firearm deer check stations. We also have a contract that we've set up with meat lockers and taxidermists for getting samples. We do have special permits that we issue to quasi-governmental agencies for deer population management. We call them deer population control permits. And in areas where those are issued with CWD, we have mandatory testing. We do collect roadkills opportunistically, and we do have our culling program. And then we do try to collect as many suspect animals as we can from wherever we can get them. As I mentioned, we have our manned firearm check stations in CWD counties. So when a county has CWD in Illinois, we establish a mandatory check station. Our traditional firearm season is a 7-day season that falls on the weekends either side of Thanksgiving. There's a 3-day weekend prior to and a 4-day season, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, the weekend after Thanksgiving. And 50 to 60% of the overall harvest in Illinois occurs during those 7 days. So it provides an excellent opportunity to collect samples. Hunters are required to bring their deer to the check station. We do not require that they be tested for a number of reasons. Trophy animals, if you're going to have your animal mounted in a traditional mount, you don't want us testing it because we will ruin the cape. We've had issues with processors, especially some of the processors across the border in Wisconsin that have said that they won't take deer that have been tested unless you have the results available. And then there's just people that have been opposed to our program. So we feel that we can get the samples that we need through the voluntary sampling without creating more ill will than we have to if we were to make it mandatory. And generally, our hunter participation has been very good. So that really hasn't been a problem, I think. For the other hunting seasons, our archery season, our muzzleloader, and then we have a late winter / CWD season that occurs in late December and mid-January. The number of samples or the number of deer that are harvested during those seasons relative to the number of days of the season make it inefficient for us to try and do manned check stations. So we have these sampling vendors that we encourage our hunters to go to. We also establish a lot of drop-off stations where hunters can take their deer heads and fill out a slip. We have what I call map books available there so that they can indicate the section where their harvest occurred and then submit the deer for testing. And there's a list of all those vendors on our website. So last year we sampled roughly 7,500 deer, primarily in the northern part of the state that corresponds with those counties that have CWD, and most of those came from the firearm check station. Downstate counties, we do through meat processors and taxidermists, obviously at a much lower intensity. We use collect Obex and retropharyngeal lymph nodes, and our testing is done the immunohistochemistry protocols. Samples are submitted to the University of Veterinary Medicine at Urbana, so all our testing is done in state. We alluded to, we don't have as great a level of sampling downstate as we do obviously where we've known we have the disease, but we've been at this for virtually 15 years now. So we feel that if there was CWD established downstate, that we would have picked it up, but we're always vigilant for that possibility. So in CWD counties, the harvest is recorded. The harvest location is recorded to the township range and section number, and then we plot that on a geographic information system. And it is interesting, if you overlap our testing results, sampling results on a map of habitat, they are virtually identical. So we really are getting a good representation of deer harvest in our CWD areas. So just further background, since 2002, we've sampled a little over 100,000 deer, 104,000 throughout the state. We've got a total of 685 positives to date. 72% of all the CWD cases found so far have come from the original 4 counties. So it was first detected in Boone and Winnebago. We'll kind of go over this, but Boone, Winnebago, McHenry, and DeKalb counties were essentially the 4 original counties that we had CWD, and even still today, most of our positives collectively have come from those original counties, what we call our core area. It's pretty much been consistent for the last almost 10 years, where we sample approximately 8,000 deer per year. And this is distribution of the results that we got last year. Last year was a reasonably decent year in terms of surprises. We didn't really have any huge surprises. We did pick up a new county, Carroll County, which is just south of Joe Davis and Stevenson, but the positives came within 1 mile to 2 miles of the border. And it really wasn't the border of Joe Davis or Stevenson County, so it wasn't a huge surprise. We really expected to see that. And then this is shows the distribution of all of our positives to date. So what happened is I mentioned this area along the Boone-Winnebago County line. So our initial detection was up here in the very north part of Boone County. And we've had a cluster of disease that established right up here in the very north part, what I would call our Roscoe area zone. And then we've had pretty well established infection along the county line, all the way down and extending into the northwest part of DeKalb County. As the time had elapsed, we saw a general expansion of the infection to the east along riparian corridors. And then as it hit the Fox River, it started to work south, extending into the Illinois River Valley. So LaSalle, Grundy, Will, the lower Fox, and then more recently we've seen positives in the Kankakee County and expansion into Livingston County. Probably the worst news we got last year in our results was this positive that located right along the Livingston-McLean County line. Now, interestingly enough, you would say, well, why aren't you getting any expansion this way? And we've got Interstate 39, I-90 is right along here, the tollway. It's because of the high traffic and nearby residential area. There's a lot of fencing, an impediment to travel of deer. And then we've got the Rock River that flows along this way. Another impediment, and then we've got the city of Rockford, the metropolitan area of Rockford. So that seems to have restricted movement to the west. We do have established infection over here in Stevenson, Joe Davis County, the southern part of the area there. Did that come from our infection or did it come from Wisconsin? It's about the same distance from Roscoe to here as it is Dodgeville, Wisconsin down here. So it's an interesting question to ponder. I don't know that it's really relevant to anything that we're going to do because it's kind of like the captive deer question. Once you got it, you've got it. It's doesn't really matter where it came from. This is another depiction of our infection as you can see, this is a collection of all the positives. The dark areas show that most of our infection has been coming from this core area, and we've seen expansion to the south, and then we've got this over in the west. So the management part of our program are those things that we do to try and limit the spread and reduce prevalence rates. We do it through hunter harvest, and then we try to supplement that with agency culling. And our management base is based on a couple of assumptions. One being that lower deer densities will result in reduced disease transmission rates. This has been touched on quite a bit over the last day and a half now. We want fewer deer moving out of CWD areas into new areas as a result of reducing deer densities. We feel that's going to reduce the spread of the disease. Ideally, if you could remove sick deer as fast or faster than the disease could create them, you could definitely beat this disease over time. Obviously, easier said than done. As far as our strategies, we want to try and increase hunter harvest in the CWD counties to create an overall reduction in deer numbers in those areas. We manage our deer in Illinois at the county level, so all of our permit quotas and et cetera are geared around the county level. So our deer managers have increased permit quotas essentially to the point where they're unlimited. They've raised them so high, much higher than any local hunters would ever buy. So permit availability is not limiting harvest in those areas. We've also added additional seasons and have included reduced price permits, trying to maximize and increase hunter harvest. Then in addition, we want to try and increase removal of deer in those specific CWD areas. Early on, we would do that exclusively with sharpshooting. In more recent times, we've tried to kind of change our messaging a little bit to get more hunter involvement in those specific areas. And part of that is establishing a sampling goal. The goal is the sampling in those areas is more geared towards trying to track hunter harvest in those specific locations, because that's the only way we know where the deer are taken short of the county level, is if they're sampled and we record harvest through that sampling process. So we establish these sampling goals, encouraging hunters in those areas to submit deer for testing, and then tracking, and then as part of our sales, if you will, for this effort, is we indicate that if hunter harvested deer contribute towards these sampling goals, and that reduces the need or the extent of the sharpshooting that may occur by the department. So what we're trying to create is our areas in our CWD infection areas. We want to have lower densities, and we'd like to reduce the number of those older animals to the extent that we can. So we want a younger age structure. We want to try and create a high population turnover rate. And I think this concept is more useful than talking about densities as a number. I think if we can create populations that are replacing themselves more quickly, I think that's a big part towards controlling the disease and reducing immigration rates out of the areas. I should also say, all these really cool slides that I'm presenting, that's Paul Shelton. Yeah, I'm lucky to be able to put my name on a slide. So anyway, CWD management. Why do we use sharpshooting? One of the things that we always heard, especially in the early days, is, why don't you just let the hunters, let us hunters do this? We can do this if you just let us. So why don't we let the hunters take care of it? Why are we using sharpshooting? Well, a big reason that we do it is access. A number of the areas that especially when we first were beginning this effort, a lot of residential areas, We have, even today, we have large tracts of land that are owned in corporate interest, near nuclear power plants, all kinds of interesting things like that. Areas where hunters have not been able to access and realistically are not going to be able to access. So we want to try and access these properties. We want tangible results. Now, when we first started CWD management, as I mentioned, our deer biologist made concerted effort to try and increase the opportunity for our local hunters to harvest deer. And as a result of that, we pretty much didn't see any increase. You can see from the chart, hunter harvest in these original 4 counties stayed pretty consistent from the pre-CWD moment through the first several years. We did see some increased removals though, but all the increase was attributed to our sharpshooting. And so to have done this exclusively with hunter harvest would have been ineffective. Specificity. So, and I think this next group of slides is very telling. You know, a lot of, when people think of disease management, they think of randomly scattered individual animals on the landscape, and that the disease would show up in a random fashion. But that's not how deer distribute themselves on the landscape. We know that deer will cluster due to habitat quantity, due to habitat quality, and as probably as important as those features are, hunting pressure is even I would think more important. Areas that are not hunted have high deer densities. Areas that are what I would call underhunted, where you have larger tracts of land where a limited number of people are hunting, and especially where the primary focus is on trophy management, we see a really high concentrations in those particular areas. So how we visualize it is you get a sick deer moving into one of these clusters. You get a lot of interaction. And it starts to build up, and then eventually you get another sick deer that ventures off and establishes infection in another one of these clusters, and so on and so on. So if we were going to rely exclusively on hunting, especially in our state where we manage at the county level, what we would have to do is ultimately remove, if we could do what we wanted to do, we would have to harvest significantly more animals than we would need to deal with disease management, because we would not be able to target the specific areas where we think the disease is, and that's got its own issues. We found in the early years especially that our sharpshooting was picking up CWD positives at a rate of 3 to 4 times what our general hunting harvest was in those same counties. So if we were going to replicate that same level of CWD deer removal, removing CWD positive animals, we would have to increase our county level harvest by a factor of 2 or 3, which is probably not possible given our experience with increasing harvest. But B, it would be particularly wasteful, especially in counties where the disease is not distributed extensively across the county. On the other hand, we felt that if we could focus our removals on the specific locations, targeting local family groups, when we pick up a diseased deer, if we can target those particular areas heavily, we have a pretty good chance of picking up additional animals that we can have a much more effective result. And so that's pretty much been our strategy from the beginning. what we do then to that end is currently we review our CWD sample positive distribution every 5 years. We review it. We review the results from the last 5 years annually. So we pick out all the locations, the sections that have had positive animals in the last 5 years. We buffer those positive sections by two sections, which becomes a DW management zone. We try to conduct aerial deer counts in those areas using helicopters over snow, and we track the locations with GPS data loggers so that we can get a pretty good idea of where the deer are and where they aren't in those distribution sampling areas. Then we take that information and provide it to our local biologists who begin talking with landowners to gain access. And then we try to get in there. One of the tools that I've found to be pretty effective or useful in talking about CWD management, because communication is the biggest challenge, is really trying to provide a means to give specific information for the local areas. And so these zone maps have been particularly helpful, providing a history of the CWD positives in the particular locations, giving an idea of how many samples we're receiving from hunters, and giving an idea of what the sharpshooting has been, because as far as sharpshooting goes, pretty much the local coffee shops give us a whole lot more credit than we can take. We do provide an idea of what the aerial count information was, and again, coming up with these sampling goals is a means to provide some boundaries to our efforts to help locals understand what it is we're doing and give them an idea of how they can contribute to that effort. As far as our sharpshooting goes, it's all DNR staff. We do it after the end of the hunting season. So once hunting season ends, the middle part of January, we start to deploy our folks, focusing in a 2-mile buffer around those positives, using land that we've been given permission to access. So it's all cooperative landowners. We try to do it safely with elevated positions, using rifles, bait, and shooting at night. I do want to touch on the baiting issue. I know there was a lot of discussion about baiting yesterday. And of course, the issue that's raised is, so you don't let us do it. Why is it such a good thing that you guys are doing the baiting? In a nutshell, when we are using bait for our culling, we are monitoring those bait sites extensively. When we start to see deer using a bait site, we'll try to remove those deer as quickly as we can. And then when a goal is reached, either for a zone or for a property, or at the end of the season, then the bait is cleaned up and removed. We don't use mineral or any other material that incorporates into the soil. We use corn and alfalfa. And why do we think we're not contributing to the spread of the disease? Because in areas where we've been utilizing this technique since the beginning and most extensively, we've actually seen infection rates stay stable and or go down. We've not really seen any areas where we've been able to employ this where they've gone up. So the benefits of the bait outweigh the cost, the benefits in increased efficiency and effectiveness in our population reduction. As an enticement to get landowners to work with us, we allow them to claim deer, and then we have a process for that. All the deer are taken whole to a processing facility, or they're taken to a lab where we do our testing, gather tissues, etc. And then they're taken to a processor. Each deer is individually processed and held till we get the results, and then donated to the local food pantry network. Just a chart that indicates the effectiveness of the sharpshooting on the sampling. As far as prevalence rates, our prevalence rates have stayed very steady, starting at about 0.5% and a little over 1%. Males are slightly more, about twice the prevalence of females. And as far as so we've done a good job on prevalence, but we have not done a good job on spread. And just a notion of how the disease has distributed itself across the landscape here. I think it's a pretty good depiction of why we don't feel it's been here all along, and we just are now finding it. So in retrospect, the blue blocks are where we initially had the infection, and then you can see where we've got it now. So pretty much in the early area, same initial areas, we still have a disease present, but at much lower levels. We do have infection well established in that Joe Davis Stevenson County area, and then down along the lower Fox and Illinois River areas. So over 100 miles to the south, 50 to the west, or 50 to the east, and some 70 miles to the west. As far as why, what are we doing this for? I think this chart tells our story of a big reason why we're doing it. The green bar indicates what happens when prevalence rates are increasing at 20% a year. And you can see that in a relatively short period, things can get ugly. The blue line is something about 5% prevalence increase, which is somewhat higher than what Illinois has seen in our prevalence. And you can see that we can extend the period where it gets bad for quite a while. So what's the point? Our effort is we're trying to keep infection levels as low as we can for as long as we can. We want to try and minimize the buildup of that infectious material on the landscape, and we want to try and minimize the spread to the extent that we can. Essentially, we're trying to buy some time. We want to, hopefully there might be a vaccine or other treatment that comes along. Hopefully we'll gain some better understanding of how the disease is distributing and how we might be more effective in our control measures. But no matter what we do, we feel that if we're dealing with less area, if we're dealing with lower levels of infection, and if we're dealing with less buildup of prions in the soil, our management efforts are going to be much more effective. And that's pretty much what I've got.